Hi, so I'm Charlotte Taylor-Drake. I'm a director in the planning team at Avison Young, and I'm joined by my colleague, Dan Rich.
Good morning, I'm Daniel Rich. I'm from the Land and Development team here at Avison Young. Louise?
Good morning all, I'm Louise Hingley, an account director focused on the Southwest within Cratus's planning communications team.
And I'm Julian Seymour, the managing director of the planning communications team here at Cratus. So thank you all for joining. It's been a pretty busy time in Parliament. Well, in fact, since we last had our BDF meeting, we've had a set of local elections and obviously a general election, and now looks like we're going to have a new NPPF today to consult on, and it likely seems to be quite a friendly one for the development community. So today we're going to whiz through a few slides to talk about what's happened, what it means, and we'd love you to put your Q&As at the bottom. If you can click on that button, they will be shown to the panel, and we might be able to answer them as we go along, or we might be able to come to them at the end. So Louise, without further ado, should we put the slides up? Okay. Hopefully everybody can see this. We're going to start with the general election, and we'll kind of go from top down and move into more detail as we go. So the general election result, I think we all know now, it was a landslide for Labour, with a bigger majority than they had in 1997, but a much smaller vote share. Conservatives down on 121. And what you can see from this graph is the rise of the independents. So you've got 33% for Labour, 23% for Tories, 12.7% for Lib Dems, which is almost exactly the number of seats if they had a proportional representation model that they would have got. 14% for UKIP, the Reform Party. Everyone keeps calling them a new party. I firmly believe they are an established party. They did not get as many seats as their vote share probably deserved. And then really importantly for this part of the world, 6.4% for the Greens. Go on, Louise. This is just looking at the historic vote shares. You can see the top two parties at the top. The interesting line there is the grey one, which is the proportion of the vote going to non-aligned parties, so the independents or smaller parties, obviously accepting the Lib Dems. That includes Scottish Nationalists, that includes Plaid Cymru, that includes the Green Party, and then all the independents that we've seen coming out this time round. So there's a lot in there, but it's gone up sharply. Also, I don't know if any of you watch the Leading podcast with Rory Stewart. Nick Clegg was on that recently, and he did mention that when people have good choices, or they feel good choices from the main two parties, then the Lib Dem vote share goes down. I feel like that's what's happened this time. They didn't feel like they had really good choices, and so the vote share of the independents went up. Okay, we can go on. This is an interesting one, just looking at who came second in lots of the cabinet members' constituencies, because it shows where they feel the pressure from. So Annalise Dodds in Oxford was Greens, Darren Jones obviously in Bristol, Greens, quite a few who've got the Greens nipping at their heels. So quite an interesting one. And then you've got the secondary lot with Reform just sat behind them. So very different opposition for them, and possibly harder to combat in many ways, because it's, dog whistle politics is difficult to address. More traditionally, just a few with Conservative, but quite a very low number, really. And then independents, these are as kind of a group of different people, but largely Muslim populations based with Palestinian Israel focus. So that just gives you an idea of the pressure each of these members will be feeling.
Okay then, and on we go to the new government. So fixing the foundations is a term that you're going to hear a lot of over the next year or so. Rachel Reeves mentioned it yesterday during her speech in regard to the funding shortfalls within the government. And here we have some of the key people. I can't overstate how important Rachel Reeves is to the wider kind of Labour project. Keir Starmer, obviously PM, but he is one of the older PMs incoming. So he's actually 61. So he may do a second term if Labour do win, but Rachel Reeves could be our next Prime Minister in the kind of medium term. And she is central to the project. Indeed, she signed off Keir Starmer's speech at party conference, which Gordon Brown could have only dreamed of doing in the Tony Blair years. And then here we have Matthew Pennycook on the far left, who will be our Secretary of State for MHCLG now. He held the shadow portfolio for quite some time in that role, and unlike the Conservative ministers that have held the position, he is likely to be within that portfolio long term. Then, of course, Angela Rayner driving the New Towns ambition, which we'll talk more about as we come up. Pat McFadden was Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury and led the Labour campaign over the last year, 18 months. And that's his deputy on the far right, Ellie Reeves, who's actually Rachel Reeves's sister. So you can see how embedded the Reeves family are within that. And she's also previously served within the Treasury in the shadow roles. And then something that we've been waiting for quite some time, someone to say, as noted on the slide. Really, I know the Conservatives have done down planning over the last year. So as a whole, the industry are very happy to hear some positive words, and Labour very much focus on growth. That is their central ambition. And they see three pillars to do and achieve growth. So the first is stability in terms of interest rates and mortgage rates as well. And then second, investment. So we know already that Rachel Reeves is spending the summer in America to drum up investment, meeting with data center providers and other investors, for example. And then the other element is reform. So reform of public services, reform of the planning system, and that goes back to the fixing the foundations. So Julian will now talk more about planning reform.
I won't labour this too much because Charlotte and Avison Young have got a fair bit to say about this, but planning reform is key to the project. We've seen a tremendous amount about planning and growth and the need to deliver development as part of the Labour project to get the economy moving. They've recognised that development is the quickest single means to increase GDP. The other projects that they manufacturing, those sorts of things take a lot longer. And if you're going to build a new factory, you still need planning anyway. So that this is the quickest single thing that they can do. But you won't ever hear Rachel Reeves talk about planning without talking about infrastructure. And that's going to be key. It's going to be increasingly problematic for her because when she talks about some of the financial holes that she's just found, and is going around the airwaves this morning touting, she's had to cancel several major infrastructure projects, including rebuilding several hospitals and some of the bigger infrastructure projects in the north. Obviously, there's lots of talk about new towns, and there is a commission out there which that's already working about how and where, potentially development corporations. Then we know, and I'm sure Charlotte will talk about Grey Belt and the 5 things that are required for that. We've got the Green Belt Review, and excitingly at 12:30 or around 12:30 today, we're going to hear the NPPF consultation be announced, lots of rumours. I don't know if everyone reads the Sunday Times, but it was trailed pretty heavily in the Sunday Times. And of course, you can read our article when it comes out about 12:31. So lots of stuff out there on that. A hint at planning committee reform, which was called in the background documents to Rachel Reeves' early speech about planning committee modernisation. Could mean anything from here's an iPad for every planning committee member, or it could mean completely different system. There's a lot of talk about citizens' assemblies, for example. And then ministers already flexing the muscles. I mean, this is just a reference to several renewables projects which have been given permission, having been stalled on desks for a very long time. So just showing direction of travel. Thanks, Louise. Obviously, DLUC has gone back to MHCLG. I hope they kept the headed paper. We've got Angela Rayner as the Deputy Prime Minister, and she's very keen on the DPM title rather than the Secretary of State title. But she is clearly being overshadowed by Rachel Reeves at the moment. And this is the Gordon Brown years and Tony Blair years again. That axis of Prime Minister and Chancellor is so important, and everybody else is slightly peripheral to that. That's just because of the importance of the economy.
And that,
oh,
sorry, Julia, just to add that suits Starmer, because Rayner has traditionally been on the left of the party and maybe not always had the best of relationships. So at the moment, that Chancellor Prime Minister axes and Angela Rayner being somewhat more on the sidelines is helpful to Starmer personally.
Yeah. Go on. Just talking a little bit about renewables. Clearly, there's this is part of the wider project to get the economy moving. So their green energy drive. Originally this was going to be a 28 billion a year project, and clearly that was reversed, and now it's going to be 8 billion over 5 years as part of the investment vehicle. But there is a clear ambition to get partnership and leverage that money to get real progress on renewables, but also in energy security. So more onshore wind, more offshore wind, and they've announced a partnership with Crown Estate, which owns the seabed, to drive that. But also we've seen the 2 solar projects, etc. So this is part of the green growth strategy, which goes hand in hand with the economic project, and it's going to be really important to them. The question is, can we ever get any new renewables growth in the southeast of England at scale? Previously, it's all been east of England, southwest, Midlands, and up. King's speech, and Charlotte's going to talk about this a lot more, but obviously a lot of bills in there, more than we anticipated, but planning reform is going to be key for us in this industry.
Okay, so onto the local picture. So as we know, Greens won the council in Bristol with 34 councillors recently, turning to committee system, but more widely, so you have Carla Denyer there, who won the Bristol Central seat. It was a tight race, but she de-seated Thangam Debonair, who almost certainly would have been in the cabinet now had she not have lost to Carla Denyer. So that was a very big win for the Greens. And then the lady to the left is the new Green MP for Brighton. But within the Greens themselves, more nationally, there's a bit more of a split. So in Brighton and Bristol, for example, that's the Greens with their kind of progressive message, left-wing party, left of Labour. But actually, Adrian Ramsey there, who's the co-leader, stood next to Carla Denyer, won in Waverley Village, and then the lady next to him won in North Herefordshire. So those were seats that they won actually off the Conservatives. And that's more of your kind of what we like to call your Tories in sandals that are more green voting. Now, a cynical person might say, well, how can the Greens, as they grow as a party, reconcile that with the voters that they're winning, say in Bristol, versus the voters that they're winning in North Herefordshire. That's a very different voter profile. And it is certainly something that we'll have to tackle. But I was reading an article by the Greens campaign director who said that actually there are progressive voters everywhere, and they feel that previously other parties haven't tapped into them, and that's what the Greens are able to do different to the other parties, and that's where they can continue to gain seats. And more notably, keep an eye on where the Greens are winning seats elsewhere, because they're very good at building up, as we've seen in Bristol, for example, building up on the council to then take the MP seats. And the Greens obviously won in Bristol Central, but they were second place in every other Bristol seat as well. And here you can see that green splodge right in the middle, but then all the other urban areas going to Labour in Bristol and surrounding, and then your Lib Dems taking the kind of outer edges, so Thornbury in South Gloucestershire, and then the North East Somerset and Hanham seat, which is one particularly notable because Dan Norris there, who's the Wecker mayor, won that seat from Jacob Rees-Mogg. So that was a big win for Dan Norris, who's also continuing to lead Wecker and be the MP for North East Somerset and Hanham. And it's worth noting as well that there were some boundary changes within this that actually helped the winners there, particularly Dan Norris, for example, in North East Somerset, bringing in, for example, Hanham, which has traditionally voted Labour. And then these are your people to watch within the government who are local MPs. So Darren Jones, particularly, if anyone was watching the news yesterday when Rachel Reeves was speaking, you can see Keir Starmer sat to the left behind, and then Darren Jones sat to the right. He's Chief Secretary to the Treasury, so almost a number two to Rachel Reeves, so a very, very important role. And then Karen Smith here, who's your MP for Bristol South. She's won that seat for a number of years, but she has been prepared to make interventions in Bristol. Particularly recently, she noted about healthcare provision and development coming forward at a scale that was much faster than the healthcare provision to support it, which there's a lot of factors that go into that. But she has been willing to make interventions where she feels it is necessary. And now, having been in the shadow portfolio holder for health, she's now the Minister of State for Health. So coming on to Wecker, Dan Norris has said that he will stay on as mayor until at least next May, when there will be elections anyway. He's not confirmed whether he would step down at those May elections. So we will see if actually he wants to continue. There may be some ruckus if he does want to continue. I know there's questions about how well he can be mayor of Wecker and an MP and serve his constituents. So we'll see if that comes to a head. But in regard to Wecker, I know that Labour are looking to increase devolution powers, but Wecker has a lot of work to do to get itself back to a good foundation. They were served a best value notice in March from DLUC, which noted a number of things, most notably that people didn't understand the vision and narrative of Wecker, that they needed to look back at the constitution to ensure more effective working, and that also there needed to be more positive professional relationships in the area. Dan Norris, for example, when Marvin was in post, didn't have the best relationship, despite them both being Labour mayors, and that has been similar with other authorities too. Obviously, the picture in Bristol has changed, and also Stephen Peacock has gone over from Chief Exec of BCC to Chief Exec of Wecker, so that will certainly help with that. But Wecker are really looking now at refreshing their regional strategy. How can they attract more investment and really benefit from becoming more empowered as a combined authority to deliver the economic growth? I know Bristol's been very good at capturing the economic growth, but perhaps other areas around Bristol have been less good at that. I'll now hand over to Dan, who's going to talk a little bit about the market sentiment in Bristol.
Perfect. Thank you very much, and good morning all. Just a couple of slides from me on thoughts on the development market and the land market in Bristol. I think we're all aware of the positivity of Bristol and what a great city it is in terms of the economy, living conditions, all the leisure opportunities that we have around the city. But I think really the headline is that urban development remains challenging here. Talking to a few developers since the election results, we think there is a slight sentiment improvement. Labour have some interesting thoughts on what could happen next, not least in planning, that Charlotte will come on to. But really the proof is going to be in the pudding. We need to see what they're planning and how it's going to be implemented before we can really get too excited about what's going to happen next. From a market perspective, talking to developers and estate agents, first-time buyers largely missing last year, but they have been returning throughout 2023, and then again in 2024 we've seen a big increase in first-time buyers again. And actually, it's only been this year when the premium market has really returned. A lot of large houses sat on the market throughout 2023, but since Christmas, since New Year, that market has really returned. Perhaps slightly surprising, given these buyers often are cash buyers and don't need mortgages, which has been one of the reasons why first-time buyers and that big base rate increase has been impacting them. A lot of the development market is looking forward to the Bank of England meeting on Thursday, the Monetary Policy Committee. They were expected to drop the 5.25% base rate in August, but the latest consensus is that really that's more likely to be September now. The graph on the right is the Purchasers Managing Index. Anything above a 50 is seen as positive and growth. And if you can just press next slide, there'll be a little red line that hopefully, oh no, my animation didn't work. There's if you could just go back one again, the last blue line on the right is the June PMI score. There is a July snap score that they've done, which is slightly ahead of the June score. But ultimately, other than June and July are still the two lowest scores in 2024. But generally, it's optimistic, and we're looking forward to growth later in the year. One of the other issues with the base rate as well is that build-to-rent yields are high, which causes viability for development of build-to-rent schemes. We expect as the Bank of England base rate comes down again, that the BTR market will start to come back, but I don't think we'll be seeing the low yields, sub 4%, 3.75, etc., that we saw a few years ago at the moment. And the next slide, please. For me, the biggest challenge in the development market in Bristol remains viability. Build cost inflation has been large. The graph on the left is the year-on-year BCIS growth. And you can see that massive spike in 2022. That has now come down and is stabilizing. But as you can see on the graph on the right-hand side, that is only slowing the growth, it's not bringing prices down. Materials we're hearing are again stabilizing, but labour is really the cause of the inflation that we're seeing at the moment. The affordable housing market is going through an interesting time. We're hearing that a lot of housing associations aren't bidding on Section 106 stock at the moment, and grant funding is slowing as well. We're not sure what's going to happen with grant funding beyond 2026 at the moment. And ultimately, we're hearing that housing associations are focusing on their own stock, their existing stock. Again, the inflation in build cost and labour costs means that they're having to refocus their strategic priorities, meaning development is not as high a priority as it were. Timescales remain uncertain. Planning has been an issue in Bristol for a while. We hear it is improving. The backlog is reducing, which is fantastic. When you're buying land, that timescale through purchase, planning, and then delivery impacts on the finance cost, and it creates uncertainty. And again, that fourth point on viability, that cost inflation piece has been around for a few years now. It's really difficult to know where, by the time you've got planning, you've built your scheme, where cost and values are going to sit. That impacts on your finance cost, your margin, etc., which impacts land value too. Looking at slightly other sectors, the student market is still strong. This was beating a lot of residential build-to-rent schemes in Bristol to land on land value basis, even before the base rate shot up. That is still continuing, and it's been even stronger since, but their planning challenge is a lot higher compared to residential and affordable housing. And co-living is the market that we're really seeing exploding at the moment. This is a relatively untested market. We have one scheme in Bristol at the moment that appears to be doing well, but we have several coming on tap. For me, it's the balance with the student and the residential market, and really it's trying to find that saturation point. Overall, it's a challenging market still. Excited to see what Labour can do next, and hopefully it should make things easier, but inflation has to come down next, and hopefully there's plenty of opportunity for what happens next.
Thanks, Dan. So I'm just going to pick up on what we've had so far in terms of Labour's growth agenda and the early announcements, but then a bit more detail about what we've heard in terms of planning and next steps. So firstly, the King's Speech announced the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which has the intention to make improvements to the planning system at a local level, modernise planning committees and increase local planning authorities' capacity to deliver an improved service. There's limited detail so far, but some thoughts on what modernising planning committees might mean, as Julian's mentioned, could include things like a national scheme of delegation potentially, or thresholds for delegated powers, additional training, or perhaps even introduction of specialists onto committees. But we'll have to watch the space in terms of what that does mean in practice. As for increasing local planning authorities' capacity, we know Labour is promising 300 additional planning officers, but where are they going to come from is a big question, and it's not going to be enough, particularly when around 25% of planners have left the public sector between 2013 and 2020, and it's going to take some time to train new planners and recruit for those roles. The briefing paper alongside the King's Speech did reference that in 2022-23, the National Development Management Service cost £794 million to operate, with an estimated funding shortfall of £262 million per annum. So watch this space for detail, but question whether this is opening a door for a further review of increasing application fees or a move towards cost recovery going through the planning process. Next slide, please, Louise. So the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, it's set to accelerate house building and infrastructure delivery by accelerating the delivery process for critical infrastructure. That's upgrades to national grid and support for renewable energy. It's going to simplify the consenting process for major infrastructure, with national policy statements then being able to be updated every 5 years. It also included reform to compulsory purchase compensation rules, so that compensation paid to landowners is fair but not excessive. I've just touched on it, but the bill is also set to improve decision-making and capacity by modernising planning committees and creating a more predictable service to developers and investors. And then finally, it's going to use development to fund nature recovery, where unlocking stalled sites, so things like nutrient neutrality, will be top of the agenda. Angela Rayner and Steve Reed, the Secretary of State for Environment, have already written to nature conservation organisations wanting to ensure a win-win for house building and nature. So we'll expect to see more on how the government will be interpreting habitats regulations over the summer. Next slide, please, Louise. Moving on to the devolution bill, it's clear that the government is getting behind increased devolution, noting that England is one of the most centralised economies in the world. The bill will give local leaders more powers over strategic planning, local transport networks, skills and employment support. And local leaders will also be expected to produce local growth plans. So is this a return to strategic planning? Potentially, and that will be important for somewhere like Bristol, where unmet housing needs is a regional issue. But we all know how regional planning has gone over the last decade, so it will need quite strong leadership and cross-party collaboration to get that moving forward. The devolution bill will also strengthen right to buy for community assets, such as empty shops, pubs and community spaces, when they're talking about empowering local communities. Next slide, please, Louise. So on to the NPPF, the conversation of the day, due out for consultation later. Unfortunately not timed before this session, so we can't give you the first overview, but I'm sure there'll be plenty of commentary over the coming weeks. What we do know is it will be out for an 8-week consultation. There's going to be changes in there around housing, probably the standard method, as well as reversing some of the changes last year around onshore wind. And we're also expecting to see changes to greenbelt policies and hopefully a definition or an approach to grey belt. Next slide, Louise. So trailed earlier this year, the golden rules for the greenbelt development set out by Labour back in April. They seek to prioritise development on brownfield land first in the greenbelt, then on greybelt land. Thirdly, they're looking to provide at least 50% affordable housing within those sites. And then in addition, new public services and infrastructure should be introduced and improvements to existing green spaces with the creation of new green spaces that would be accessible to local people. So a few criteria to get through, but it does seem to be relaxing some of the policy criteria around greenbelt development. Next slide, please, Louise. We're expecting the government to publish the NPPF revisions today. And there's also been mention of toughened affordability ratios, and there's still a question of whether 35% uplift will remain for England's 20 largest towns and cities. But in her early speech, Rachel Reeves confirmed that Angela Rayner would also write to local planning authorities to make it clear what's expected of them, including universal coverage of local plans and reviews of greenbelt boundaries. Hopefully, there'll also be a written ministerial statement or statements that will help us determine what weight can be applied to the NPPF consultation document, as well as thinking about transitional arrangements. We've got a plan-led system, so there will be questions about how to apply policies in plans that are already in place. We'll also be looking for clarity on the timings around guidance for amended local plans and things that came out of the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. So all in all, a lot to look out for, as well as proposed national development management policies that hopefully will come out later this year as well. So government's done a lot in its first few weeks to try and shake things up, but how much of this is actually going to change things on the ground? Planning ultimately is still a function of local government and still requires support from local politicians. So we're going to need to still engage widely in terms of bringing forward development. The resource and skills issue is deep-rooted and doesn't just sit with local planning authorities. Statutory consultees are also under pressure, and 300 additional planners is ultimately a drop in the ocean for what needs to be achieved. We need wide-ranging resource building across various different disciplines to make the system work effectively. And ultimately, as Dan's mentioned, viability challenges will also still continue. Development needs to achieve a lot, and on constrained sites, delivering policy compliant affordable housing is a real challenge. Overall, it feels like these changes will have an impact on house building, but within cities and urban areas, land availability and development constraints are still going to guide what can be achieved. Next slide, please, Louise. So just picking up then on what that means for the west of England and Bristol, as we've talked about, the devolution agenda is likely to see a strengthening of WECA and the Metro Mayor. Whilst there have been some issues that Louise mentioned earlier, over the last few years, WECA has quietly built a strong leadership team with the experience to drive this important regional change. So we'll have to see whether that prevails. Maybe there will also be another revival of strategic planning, as I've mentioned. At a regional level, we can see the potential for greenbelt and greybelt opportunities in the region, particularly when thinking about unmet need. but coordinated planning is going to take time, and it's still going to need buy-in at local level. And there's still the question of how WECA interacts with North Somerset as well. Additionally, within Bristol, there'll still be discussions to have on city centre height and density, balanced with affordable housing, sustainability standards, heritage, biodiversity, green infrastructure, all of the elements that make up a good scheme, and how they are balanced against viability. These are things that we're going to need to grapple with, certainly in the short to medium term. And as I've mentioned, the resource constraints are also not going to be solved quickly. Next slide. But on a positive note, there's no signs yet of the local plan processes in the region slowing down. South Gloucestershire has published its consultation on meeting Bristol's unmet need, so that's going on until the 13th of September. We've also seen some documents start to be published in advance of the examination of the Bristol local plan. So there was an initial set of preliminary questions published, as well as council main modifications and response to consultation. And we're also anticipating further consultation on the Baines local plan and North Somerset plan before the end of the year. So I can't tell you too much about the NPPF, but look out for the briefing note that Julian's going to issue in a couple of hours' time. And we will wrap it up there, but happy to take questions and any discussion points.
Sure, thank you very much for that. And that has actually already been one question. I think one of the questions that we all want to know the answer to, which is, do we know what the definition of grey belt will be? I don't think we do, although I suspect it will be not too dissimilar from previously developed land. I think that was what Keir Starmer sought to do, is rebrand it. I think the Greenbelt brand has become very problematic because people don't understand what it is. By designating these, a technical designation, these previously developed land sites, grey belt, it makes it much more vivid for the public that they are not green and lush, and it makes it easier then to develop them rather than the technical definition. But Charlotte, you may have more.
Yeah, I think hopefully we will get more clarity on it to be able to give us some answers on that, because there are, I think what we've seen so far seems to be referring to effectively brownfield sites that fall within the green belt. But the colour wash, I don't think is going to change some of the planning issues that we're going to have to deal with in terms of those sites. There's still going to be considerations in terms of sustainability and accessibility, transport, all of those elements, and infrastructure, as we've heard a few times in terms of the focus on infrastructure.
And just extending that point, I think the huge issue is, in planning terms, the changes to the NPPF will probably make the policy more favourable towards development. I think it's not going to change the public attitude towards development in greenbelt areas. We're in greenfield areas, so I think there's going to be remaining challenges, particularly where there's not a lot of new government money for infrastructure to go with it. So the expectations on developers, as you'll have seen from most sharply up their golden rules, is that developers will provide all of the infrastructure themselves. Now, I'm not sure how possible that is, particularly if you're already providing 50% affordable and a good chunk of BNG and all the other things that we now have to provide. So that's going to be an ongoing challenge. We'll just have to see exactly what the NPPF says. Second question then, noting Labour's recent comments on large-scale renewable projects, has there been any indication on the approach to be taken to sustainability policies applied to development projects? Charlotte, is that one for you?
Sorry, can you just mention that again?
Yeah, so effectively, has there been any indication of the approach to sustainability policies on development projects?
I think there's not been anything trailed in terms of changes at a national level. We know that there was the written ministerial statement in December talking about local plans or policies shouldn't go beyond policy building regulations in terms of seeking uplifts. There's some changes I've noticed in the latest documents published by Bristol, where they've made some amendments to the emerging sustainability policies on that basis. But at a national level, I think the building regulations are still going to lead the way in terms of those standards.
Yeah, I think there's been some interesting commentary around councils that try to go beyond the national policies, haven't there? And that whether that's worked or not, it's just kind of working its way through the system. Obviously, particularly interested in Bristol, sort of Green Council. I did see Tony Dyer quite recently, who emphasised multiple times that Bristol is still very much open for investment, at the same time as saying, you know, we want to see a different type of development, mid-rise, mansion blocks, all those sorts of things. So there will be a change of emphasis. Can that work with all the other things that we're being required to do? We shall see fairly shortly. I think Louise has just put up a poll about changes to the MPPF. Hopefully you can all see that, and we'd love to see your answers. Another question just come in then from David. Noting the need to finance the process of getting your planning permission, has the panel seen any new ideas around ring fencing planning performance agreement fees so developers get some action for their PPA investment? Great question.
Really good question.
And you know, I think we all want to see. I mean, we all were probably quite encouraged that planning fees went up last year, and then dismayed to see it just went into the general council pot. Have you seen anything, Charlotte, that says it's going to?
I guess in terms of ways that it's worked more successfully, it's probably when you're directly financing an external consultant at the moment, in terms of the consultant providing their fee proposal and you're effectively directly paying for their time, which means that I'm assuming that money has to go directly to them, so it is effectively ring fenced. But we've only really found that that's happened with certain disciplines and not across different disciplines within the council. So you still get blockages at certain levels in terms of that technical specialism.
Thank you. Next one then, this is far too technical for me. Do you have any insights regarding how the compulsory purchase rules will be reformed?
I think it's still early days, is the answer. I know there was lots of trials from Labour on trying to reform the process and make it simpler, maybe remove hope value in the hope of reducing the complexity and trying to speed up the whole process. Really, it is very early days on that. We really need to see the detail. The idea is to unlock site assembly infrastructure to speed up delivery elsewhere. But again, there's so many questions on that. It's too early to say. We want to see more before really answering that question properly, frankly.
Yeah, totally agree with that. I think we've seen some hints that the Labour government wants Homes England to be a bit more punchy and get these schemes unlocked, as it said, although of the schemes that it mentioned in Rachel Reeves' speech, the 3 screens, Liverpool, Worcestershire Parkway and North Stowe, actually they're all moving ahead, albeit slowly, like all of these major projects. And I don't think land assembly is the biggest issue necessarily in those 3 instances. How they want Homes England to move and operate is going to be an interesting question. I think every government, in fact, every iteration of the Tory government we've seen over the last few years has changed their set of priorities and remit. I think if Rachel Reeves and Angela Rayner can give it some stability, which is one of their pillars, that will probably help.
And certainly the Homes England point was something that was raised in Kate Barker's latest recommendations around Homes England acting as more of a master developer or having that role with development corporations as well.
Yeah, again, come back to development corporations. I think there's a lot of interest in whether Labour are actually going to push ahead with those or not. Quite a few hints, quite a lot of rumours going around that development corporations are coming back. Haven't seen anything yet. Of course, one of the features of development corporations when they were really successful was they benefited from lots of public funds. I'm not sure that there's that much money knocking around for that, but we'll see.
Yeah, something noticeably not in the King's speech was the legislation around new towns and how that's actually going to come forward.
Yeah, yeah. The last Newtowns Act is some 70 years old. It still works, still on the statute book, but
Yeah.
I think things have moved on. Unless I haven't got any more questions, so anyone who would like to just ask any last questions, please do. Otherwise, I'm going to ask the panel for some final thoughts, and anything they've missed that I'd love to say. Dan, anything you'd like to comment on?
I think we're just looking forward to the MPPF. We're hoping that from a development side, from a landowner side, we're looking for hopefully simplification and unlocking sites that are currently difficult to deliver, but cautiously optimistic, I think, from me.
Charlotte and Louise, I hope you're getting yourself prepared.
Yeah, getting ready to do lots of reading later. Yeah, I think it feels like there's a lot being said, but the proof will be in whether it actually changes things on the ground. We've seen a lot of reform or trials of reform over the last few years, and it's there's obviously a drive there, but the system sometimes gets in the way.
Yes. Louise?
Just to add, really, it's good to see development in the spotlight and in the headlines, particularly more positively. And I know that our poll shows that people are feeling more optimistic about the MPPF changes. So hopefully Labour deliver on those.
And just from me, I think the two interesting points are stability. I think Rachel Reeves, she's made this her massive driver. So I think once the regulations change, I think they're going to resist, Labour senior leadership going to resist pressure, because they've obviously now got a whole lot of Greenbelt MPs, and they're going to resist pressure from them, however much they're squealing about the effects on their particular electorate. There are also some interesting pressure groups within Labour emerging who are pro-development and are just, they're younger MPs. They're of the generation that they do not have homes and do not know, represent people who are looking for homes. So I think there's going to be a lot of emphasis on development, and I think they're going to stay the course. And the second thing is really that I think we're going to see quite a lot of resistance locally. I think we've already seen letters from the leaders of East Hants, for example, open letters to Angela Rayner saying, we're in unique circumstances. We've got National Park on one side and Greenbelt on the other. Can you take our numbers down? And I think the answer is going to be a flat no. But those leaders are going to be able to go back to say, look, I've done everything I can. So I think there'll be quite a lot of positioning going on over the next few months.
The one thing further to add on your point about perhaps some Labour MPs in areas designated for growth squealing is that last week you'll have noted that Starmer set out his position on party discipline. Those, I think it was 11 MPs that rebelled against the two-child benefit cap were subsequently removed with the whip. So Starmer from the office has set out that he will be strong on party discipline, which bodes for planning reform as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time. Thank you to the Avison Young team and to Louise for organising all of this. And look, I hope we see you in our meeting in September, and we'll send the details.